back to one of our leading stories. Eskom is today set to embark on a large-scale switch-off operation in Gauteng today, targeting illegal power connections. The grid has been under severe strain, leading to blackouts and damage to infrastructure. Energy and infrastructure expert Ruse Moleshe joins me now to chat more about this. Ruse, thank you so much for your time and a very good morning to you. What are the key reasons do you believe are behind the prevalence of illegal connections, especially in informal settlements? And how do these unauthorized connections impact on the reliability and sustainability of the electricity supply in some of those areas?
So the connection of illegally of users means that the capacity of the infrastructure is overloaded, which is a risk to its performance, impacting on the customers that are paying. So typically what is supposed to happen is the demand grows, the infrastructure is supposed to be upgraded to allow for everybody to connect. So if there are illegal connections, they add to the demand, which causes constraints.
And what do you think has led us to this point in terms of this demand is growing, but it seems as though the supply is not growing in as much an exponential rate as the demand is?
It's a different reasons. As I say, some of that demand is not legitimate demand. It's demand that comes from people that connect illegally. Some because of affordability, they are not able to continue to afford. And when they are switched off, they try find means to get back into connection. Some never have an intention to pay at all, so they will connect illegally. So it's different reasons. And but at the end of the day, it impacts on infrastructure, and therefore there needs to be load reduction to avoid the infrastructure challenges that will happen if the congestions continue.
Speaking of that infrastructure, I mean, despite efforts to remove some of the illegal electricity connections, residents often resort to reconnecting illegally shortly afterwards. What challenges do you think this poses, especially for the city, in maintaining the integrity of that electricity infrastructure and also just ensuring equitable access to electricity for all the residents that you say will then be impacted at the end of the day?
It is a big challenge because in some cases, it is people that have knowledge around reconnection that could potentially be people who have worked in the system or people who know the system from the past. So it's very difficult to control when people can be able to go back and quickly reconnect. And as you correctly point out, it then affects the equity in terms of those who are able to pay and willing to pay, and those who continue to try and connect illegally. It becomes a challenge because then there has to be load reduction to protect the infrastructure.
Speaking of load reduction, and we've seen load reduction in many township areas as opposed to urban areas, and we could attribute it to what you're saying, that if some of these informal settlements are connecting illegally, then the implication will be to those settlements that are closest to them, which would then be townships. Where do we then draw the line between energy poverty and just the ability of municipalities being able to provide electricity as a public good?
Well, sometimes it depends which area you are in. Some of the cities have themselves, because they have not been able to collect efficiently, take long to upgrade infrastructure, and that also has an impact. So it's not always one-sided, that is the consumer alone that has issues. But at the end of the day, it all becomes a problem that affects everybody, and including those indigent users that are subsidized by the state to access the electricity. Once you do reduction impacts everybody.
And
I don't know if I answered the question.
No, you certainly have, and I think in it impacting everybody, then there needs to be a collaborative effort between the city, communities, stakeholders, and also the energy providers. From a legal standpoint and a safety standpoint, how then would you think addressing some of these socio-economic drivers of illegal connections would help if there is that collaboration between all these stakeholders?
I think that it would help if there was collaboration, because in some areas, I think there was once I think Newzroom Afrika did some expose where people in Alexander were saying some of us would like to pay, but when everybody else is not paying and you still get affected by a reduction, at the end of the day, it becomes a disincentive for us to also do that. So I think you are right. There needs to be a strategy where communities are involved, especially communities that are willing to protect the infrastructure, working with the authorities. But it's really not an easy task to isolate and say these are the people that are there. Also, especially when the authorities themselves sometimes are not able to manage the billing processes, and then there's a leakage there as well. So it's kind of in some areas, it's kind of very difficult to resolve.
It certainly does become a catch-22. So with that said, Ruse, I mean, given the complex interplay between socio-economic factors, the infrastructure vulnerabilities that you make mention of, the needs of a community, how can a holistic approach be adopted to address the challenges of illegal connections while also safeguarding the rights of residents to that access and them having affordable energy services?
Look, in terms of affordability, it's really becoming difficult for citizens in general. And our system, unfortunately, is that of a user pays, irrespective of how much we keep on having the electricity prices increasing. You still find that it's a very difficult, complex problem. That's not just a technical problem, but it relates to socio-economic issues, and it relates to service delivery. I don't know if I have the answer to it, but I don't think it's a one-pronged approach where you are looking at enforcement only. There should be also, on the socio-economic side, some interventions to help those, especially indigent users, some not really falling under that category, but in reality are overwhelmed by just the cost of generally cost of things in the economy, so it's a very difficult thing, because we look at it from a technical perspective. It's infrastructure. You pay. If you don't pay, you cut you out and all of that. But I think it's a much more complex socio-economic issue, and just general lawlessness in some issues as well. So there's an element of enforcement as well.
Is there an element of lack of awareness and education? I mean, you make mention of indigent residents. Do people even know what it is to be indigent, and what are some of the benefits if they then go and apply, and how that system would work?
I think because it's been there for a while, there is some level of understanding. But to what extent it's helpful, I don't know. I mean, if generally, making the example with Alexander, if generally there's always an overload and always reductions and all of that, the interest, I think, of the people becomes more about we are getting a reduction and less about how do I make sure that I go into the system and I benefit as a person who's not able to pay. So it becomes that there's no, at a certain point in time, there's disconnection in any case, and we are struggling. And therefore, that becomes the focal point.